Thank you. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. I was, again, so happy to point out how grateful I am for my dad's service with the 14th Air Force in India and China. And so I've just grown up, and I grew up in the holy city of Charleston, South Carolina, in the shadow of the Charleston Air Force Base. And so I just have, and I have a nephew in the Air Force too. So, hey, very proud of y'all's service. Secretary Kendall, you've clearly articulated the urgent need to transform and modernize U.S. Air Force. I support the Air Force's plan to modernize its fighter fleet where smart and necessary to divest aircraft to maximize our ability to field the most ready and lethal force possible. I'm concerned, though, that the Air Force is taking the path of least resistance when it comes to fighter roadmap. I understand the Air Force basing plan simply places F-35 at F-15C locations instead of those locations best suited to build and preserve F-35 combat readiness. What is your position that current and future F-35 basing decisions will include both a short and longer-term readiness criteria, and that you'll expand the candidate list beyond the installations with retiring aircraft? And second, will you ensure that you will direct your staff to seek out and evaluate creative basing solutions that provide for cost-effective, innovative basing solutions?
Congressman, I haven't had a chance to look at F-35 basing decisions yet in my tenure, but I will promise you to do so. Mission performance is going to be a very fundamental concern, and I don't think we should be overly constrained as we look at that metric. We need to support combatant commanders in all the theaters where we need to worry about high-end threats, but also we need to have forces that can flex and go support where they're needed when they're called upon. And I know we are deploying F-35s and basing F-35s forward, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Alaska is one of the bases that we've selected, which can provide support in either direction fairly efficiently. So those things I know are taken into account, but I haven't had a chance to review them personally. And I am open to creative ideas about this. I am always open, I hope, to creative ideas to improve our performance or our capabilities. I'll let General Brown comment. I'm sure he has more on that.
I appreciate the question. One of the areas is we are really looking more broadly across not only our fighter fleet, but many of our other fleets, stepping back and taking a more strategic look at what's the right basing based on the current environment, what we project the environment to be vis-a-vis the threat here in the future. And that will actually drive us into, as the Secretary described, being a little bit more creative than the way we've done things historically going forward for basing for fighters and other capabilities as well.
Thank you, both of you, for that. And again, Mr. Secretary, I'm grateful to work with Congressman Jim Clyburn, who physically represents the McIntyre Joint National Guard base, and which is so advantageous for long-term F-35 readiness. It is a U.S. Air Force owned and operated autonomous federal installation, maintains an F-35 compatible infrastructure, provides exceptional clear airspace, and welcome to the community too. They like the sound of freedom. Has appropriated funding for F-35 compatible simulator facility, possesses organic ranges, hosts the best training environment on the East Coast with the most clear, again, without interfering with local communities, and retains unlimited space for growth and enjoys limited encroachment concerns. My question, will you work with Congressman Jim Clyburn and myself in a bipartisan effort to evaluate a F-35 basing plan for McIntyre Joint National Guard base, which not only affords the infrastructure for F-35 to thrive for decades, but also yields a modernized F-16 Block 52s for capture and use by the active Air Force institutional requirements, as well as capitalization of the fighter wing inside the Air National Guard?
Yes, Congressman, happy to work with you on that.
And I hope you visit beautiful Eastover, South Carolina, where, Senator Clyburn's so lucky he represents such a wonderful community, and just, again, Joint Base does great. And then finally, a question in regard to upgrading F-35s. What's the consideration of installations across the Air National Guard for future F-35 basing, Ms. Secretary?
We will be upgrading F-35, some of the ones we bought in earlier configurations. I haven't had an opportunity to look at a plan for exactly how we're going to do that or what units will be affected. Mission requirements would, I think, be the driving concern in that, however. But I will take a look at that as part of the overall F-35 scheme for future fielding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Norcross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, gentlemen. Obviously, some things have changed, as they do each and every year, but when it comes to the tactical era, it has changed at a more rapid pace, certainly from what we're handed out today. So we heard earlier that back in 2010-12, the last F-22 was $130 million roughly. That's about $155 million today dollars versus the F-35 as we see it today, around $80 million, or the next block, which could be $90 to $95 million, and the EX and the prices. We're all concerned about the price that we buy these aircraft at. But we also know that 2/3 of the cost, almost 70%, is in the sustainment. So I think having a discussion of how much we're buying it versus how much it's costing us needs to be discussed together, because those are real dollars that are literally making us make decisions today on aircraft that were produced years ago and putting us in a very difficult position. NGAD being one of those, and the development costs for that 6th generation. Secretary, you talked about the F-22 being replaced by NGAD. When we look at some of the original projections of when that would be available, we are sliding to the right further later. In addition to coming in later, and there potentially is that gap that could take place, how do you look at closing that risk, that gap, and at what price do you expect a copy to come in of the NGAD? The price per copy, how much for that? And then we can talk about sustainment of it later on.
This is a number that's going to get your attention, but we're talking about prices that are multiple hundreds of millions of dollars for NGAD on an individual basis.
That's with the pilot, correct?
Yes.
The copy.
That's a piloted manned aircraft. So it's going to be an expensive airplane. F-22 was an expensive airplane. It was one of mine aircraft in one of my earlier positions, but it's also an incredibly effective aircraft. It's been dominant in the air for decades now. And we expect NGAD to be the same, but NGAD is going to have to be accompanied by things that are not as expensive to give overall mission capability, which is the reason we're going down the uncrewed combat aircraft route. You mentioned cost control. That starts in development. It starts with the design, combination of the requirements, but also for sustainment in particular, ensuring that you can do upgrades and do maintenance very efficiently. So it's worth the time and the effort in the earlier phases of a program like NGAD to get those things right, because you're going to pay for what you did much later in sustainment with much bigger dollars. And from what I've seen of the NGAD program so far, that approach has been taken. They've taken a very good approach to having modular designs and interfaces that the government controls so they can upgrade the program over time, keep it current technically so it can stay in the force for a long time and stay as advanced as possible, but also to introduce competition, to get costs down through competition as you go forward. So despite the fact that it is going to be an expensive aircraft, there are a lot of things being done in that design today to keep the cost under control as much as possible.
And this is a discussion, Chairman Garamendi, in readiness. He keeps telling me I'm throwing a cheap plane that costs him more to sustain it. But let's talk about the accompanying NGAD more affordable. What are you looking at price per copy for some more of those? Expendable is probably not the right word, but
we don't have a final price per copy yet. We don't have a hard estimate, I think, yet that we could point to. Crude estimates are in the order of magnitude that I talked about.
All right, so we talked about the cost. How about the time frame, which is sliding to the right?
I'm sorry.
With the time frame, it's coming in much, or predicted to come in much later than we originally had expected. When you start talking about the F-22 holding out that long, there appears to be.
We're looking at fielding capability in the early 30s right now. So I can get you a schedule we have. It's a classified program, so I'm not sure how many details we're even making public, but it's in the early stages of development, but it's far enough along in terms of concept. It's actually built on, NGAD platform is built on technology demonstration program that I started when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition. It was called the Aerospace Innovation Initiative. And it was to build X-planes that demonstrated key technologies for the next generation of tactical air warfare. And that program has been pretty successful. We've built some prototypes that have matured the key technologies, but now we have to go to the design we're going to use for production, which is not going to be the exact.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary and Generals, thank you for being here. I do want to make sure that as we work towards that final number and we're looking at the list of unfunded priorities, that we're keeping into mind the civilian workforce and the uniform workforce and what inflation has done to them. And they are the most important asset that we have in the military. And as someone who represents Robins Air Force Base and Moody Air Force Base, I want to just make sure that workforce is taken into account with what inflation has done to them. With that said, General Brown, your predecessor, General Goldfein, and I had a lot of discussions about JSTARS and ABMS. I will pick on the Army since they're not here. I did see their request this week for a manned aircraft for ground moving target indicator that looked very similar to what the JSTARS recap looked like. I know the Air Force is committed to ABMS, and I appreciate your commitment to that and to Robins Air Force Base. But is there any discussion with the Army potentially about transferring the GMTI mission that currently exists to them, since they're now requesting a manned GMTI platform?
We have not had that conversation. We talked to them about at least my intel professor talked to them about the platform, and letting them know that the Space Forces are going to really help us with ground moving target indication based on some of the capabilities they're pursuing, and that's the approach we're taking as well. We do have the Global Hawk Block 40 that can do some of that as well. So I think there's ways we can solve this from a joint perspective using the Space Force capabilities. I question why we're going down the path of pursuing something that we're trying to move away from. And if you go back to, we're not going to be in permissive environments where you can actually operate like we have in the past.
So you understand my concerns with the difference of messaging today versus a few years ago with actually a manned ISR that is not survivable versus China and Russia. And any concerns about as the JSTARS drawdown becomes faster, the loss of ISR for our combatant commanders, or are you convinced that we can fill the capability gap with JSTARS coming down?
I believe we can fill the gap, but I also, as I said earlier, there will be some risk here. But I also think about how we can do our ISR today. And it's not always from an airborne platform. With the amount of information that's available, the amount of capability we have in space, whether it's provided by the military, provided by the intelligence community, or things we're able to look at commercially. There are so many different ways to get the information in ISR, and we're in some cases infatuated with some of the airborne platforms, but we have capacity and capability, and we've proven that time and time again of how we're able to get the information to our combatant commanders. It doesn't necessarily always come from an airborne platform.
Well, Raymond, I do have a question I want you to answer too, but it was announced earlier this week that the United States would no longer test ground-based systems to destroy satellites. Do you believe that the Chinese and the Russians would agree to no longer do that, or is this going to be an area where the United States is going to simply stand alone and our adversaries are going to continue to test the ability to use ground-based missiles to destroy satellites?
We're hoping that the initiative that we've taken, the administration has taken, will encourage others to join us. We're not giving anything up because we weren't going to do that kind of a test anyway. We can get the testing that we need done without a destructive debris-creating test. We just saw Russia recently do such a test. China's done them in the past, and we want to put as much pressure on them to not do that kind of test as possible, and this is part of the effort to do that.
If you look at the numbers of objects that we were talking about earlier, the number of objects that are going to be launched into space, we have got to keep the space domain free of debris. It's going to become increasingly congested. As the Secretary said, this was about destructive tests. There's other means of doing those tests. We would not do an irresponsible behavior like China or Russia has done in the past.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. General Brown, in a 2021 op-ed with General Berger, Commandant of the Marine Corps, you explained that a fundamental change is needed to occur to address the 2018 National Defense Strategy funding priorities was the definition of readiness. How do you define readiness? And how does this budget address the changes to that definition?
I look at readiness as not just based on availability of the capability or the amount of resources, but it's the aspect of our ability to have our airmen are trained to meet the demands to use that equipment in the scenarios that we expect to see in the future. In this particular budget, the areas we put into readiness is into our readiness accounts for our flying hour program for our weapons system sustainment, but it's also into our operational test and training infrastructure into our ranges. And two of the key ranges that we're focused on is the Nellis Test and Training Range and the Joint Pacific Alaska Range up in Alaska J Park. Those are a couple of key areas. But the other aspect that I'll also tell you that's maybe not so much in the budget, but it's really our processes of how we do this and balance this. And there's ongoing conversations within the Air Force, but I'll also say with the Marine Corps and the Joint Force, how we do this a bit better. Matter of fact, conversations this last week of each of the services defined as readiness a little bit differently. We need to get closer to the same page and not only just look at availability, but capability and the trend lines associated with readiness as we make decisions for force management in the future.
If you have a bunch of aircraft that are ready to go, they can be flown tomorrow, but they're combat ineffective against the adversaries we're going to face, then that doesn't count as readiness. I think that's the key point. As this discussion goes on with the other services, please let us know if there's anything we can do to accelerate it, because I think this is a place where we clearly need to make a change to deal with the fast evolving threat. Have you been able to make any of these changes with your subordinate commands in terms of just how they report readiness up to you?
I have been able to, and part of this is us, being disciplined about the approaches we take, and our airmen want to serve, and therein lies part of the challenge. When things happen, they want to lean forward, but we got to balance that over time, and this is why we went to our Air Force Force Gen model to lay out in really it's a 4-bin model to ensure that we can commit, be ready to commit, prepare, and then reset after we've been committed from a force standpoint. And that's a process we're going through internal to the Air Force to help reshape ourselves to ensure that we report readiness much better, but we don't burn all our readiness up front and then leave a hole when there's a crisis that comes in the future.
General Raymond, can you comment on this as well for the Space Force?
I'd be happy to. Historically, we've had the luxury of measuring our readiness in space against a peaceful, benign domain without a threat. And so that's not the domain that we find ourselves in today. So we've really done a restructure of how we do readiness as well. Part of that's the reporting to me to make sure that we're looking at it a lens through a contested domain. The other thing that's different, we are largely employed in place. Most of our readiness models bias the deployed capabilities that deploy into theater. And so we've had to reconstruct our readiness models to best capture readiness from an employed in place 24/7 type of force.
Mr. Secretary, we've obviously been very focused on Ukraine lately. Can you give us 2 examples of lessons that we have learned from the conflict in Ukraine and how they are reflected in your budget?
We watched the buildup as it was occurring, and we're aware that there was a pretty significant probability that Russia would invade Ukraine. So there are some considerations perhaps from that in our budget. Generally speaking, the type of threat we're seeing there is not a surprise to us. And China being the pacing challenge from a technical point of view and an operational point of view, that was one that really motivated us more than anything else. We are all watching Ukraine right now, and it's a bit early to draw a lot of judgments from it. I'll leave the political other judgments to others, but from the point of view of military operations, and I think the chiefs can talk on this too, the failure of Russia to achieve air superiority early and to control the air decisively, I think has been a major impediment to their attempt in the invasion. The other thing on the other side of the equation is that the effectiveness of the air defenses, particularly weapons like Stinger and SA-10, and anti-armor munitions for that matter as well. Some of those weapons were very important in keeping the Russians out of the air and extracting losses from them. Part of that is because of the tactics that the Ukrainians used. They used what they had well, and they were able to keep those systems alive despite the threat and use them effectively.
Time
So
has
we can learn a lot from that.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Descharlet is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall, the unfunded priorities list that you submitted to Congress included $197 million for hypersonic testing. And I'd like to get a better idea of where that money is going. So first, how do you assess the current hypersonic test capability within the Air Force Test Center? And second, what impact will the requested funding have in shoring up the existing gaps in that capability?
Thank you, Congressman. Just to be clear, I did not submit an unfunded requirements list. Chief Brown and Chief Raymond did.
All right.
We did put money mostly through the Secretary of Defense's office, the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, into advancing our hypersonic test capabilities. And I'll let General Brown talk about the explicit impact of the addition he would increase. But I believe it would simply accelerate what we were already planning to do to get us more capability sooner.
Okay, General Brown.
Sure. You know, part of the reason why we wanted to put this not only in funded priority list, but as we look through our budget is all the services that are pursuing hypersonic capability. Our hypersonic test facilities are not where they need to be, not only in capability but also in capacity. And what I wanted to do with this unfunded priority was actually put more focus. We already put some investment into it, but we continue to put more investment into those facilities. And we work very closely with OSD because they have most of the oversight for this, but we've got to work together with the other services to ensure we can do the testing to ensure we can provide that capability here in the future.
Okay. I'm curious to know whether you would like to see Congress consider increasing thresholds for minor construction authorities like the Lab Revitalization Development Program in light of the inflation that we're seeing impacting this money.
I would say that would give us a bit more flexibility for minor construction. I think this is something we probably need to review periodically as costs increase, whether it's inflation or just general cost and how we define that. We do that in other areas as well. I think it'd be worth considering.
Okay. Back to you, Secretary Kendall. In the recent months, you've made some interesting comments on your vision for hypersonic weapons and the purpose they should play in the U.S. arsenal. Last month at a panel for the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, you questioned, or you had the question of whether you can do the job with conventional missiles at less cost just as effectively, and then went on to say that hypersonics are a way of penetrating defenses, but they're not the only way, and I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit on those thoughts.
A combination of things we can do, which include stealth, decoys, penetration aids of various types, jamming. So there are other things we can do to penetrate defenses. Hypersonics do have a role, and we do need hypersonics. I don't think that they're a panacea, and they're not always the most cost-effective solution, but they are an important capability that we do want to get into the inventory.
Mm-hmm. We've all been kind of concerned at some of the AARW's failures over the past year, and we poured significant investment into those in the FY22 budget. Can you provide us with an update on the Air Force plans and goals to develop the field of hypersonic weapons? And then in the FY23 budget request, it looks like we may be shifting focus away from the AARW towards the hypersonic attack cruise missiles. And would you say that's fair?
We funded the research and development on Aero. We haven't funded the production yet. And the reason for that is primarily that they've had a number of test failures. We want to see some success before we commit production money. We're interested in both of those concepts, and I think I'd have to get into some classified information to talk about the exact applications of both.
Okay. General Raymond, as the conflict in Ukraine drags on, we continue to see China and Russia inch closer together diplomatically and militarily, and this extends into the space domain as well. As we see Sino-Russian ties produce agreements for cooperation on lunar missions and proposed joint international lunar research station, how are you assessing the threat environment in the space domain currently, and are you concerned by these closer ties between Russia and China?
Space is clearly a warfighting domain, As I mentioned, there's a significant threat today, and that threat is growing. Everything from reversible jamming to kinetic destruction. It is concerning to see Russia and China work together in areas that would not be in our best interest. But I will tell you, we have the best partnerships and allies in the world, and it's one of our great strengths. We have worked really hard over the past couple years to really strengthen these. Not only, it used to be that our international partnerships were one-way kind of data sharing arrangements. Now we're operating together, training together, developing norms of behavior together, funding capabilities together. So I would put the strength of our partnerships well ahead of anything that China might do.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Raymond, thank you for your testimony. I was pleased to see in your written testimony you address how the Space Force can help confront challenges in the gray zone. As you know well, Russia and China are saturating the globe with state-backed propaganda, and we don't have to look further than Russia's blatant lies about its invasion of and the ongoing war in Ukraine to see this trend. Within the broader context of gray zone activities, how do you think Space Force can strengthen and amplify joint force initiatives to confront this challenge?
I think we've seen in the conflict, the Russian-Ukraine conflict, where space has...
I'm sorry, General, can you just wait 1 second? I can't hear. Okay, proceed.
I think you've seen very clearly in the Russian-Ukraine conflict where space, including commercial space, has provided great advantage to Ukraine, especially in the gray zone. Commercial space has allowed us to share information much more broadly. It has allowed us to see the AOR in much greater clarity. And so I think space has been really instrumental in helping shape this gray zone competition, especially leading up to the conflict.
Excellent. Mr. Kendall, Secretary Kendall, the Solomon Islands recently signed a security agreement with China, which would allow Beijing to deploy troops to the Solomons and could even result in the first Chinese military base in the Pacific. This altering the status quo requires the United States to further strengthen our regional alliances and partnerships. What is your perspective on expanding the Five Eyes intelligence partnership to close out in the regions such as Japan or South Korea? Japan's ISR network, for example, is robust with capabilities including the RQ-4s, E-2s, and P-1s, all of which would be critical additions to the theater situation awareness in any Taiwan scenario. Is the Air Force considering anything along those lines or contributing to any discussions on the potential expansion of Five Eyes?
That would not be something the Air Force would do on its own. That would be something that would be done, at least at the DoD level, I think. We do work very closely with Japan and South Korea. This is kind of the idea of Japan becoming part of the Five Eyes or Korea becoming potentially part of it has come up before, but that's not something the Air Force is working directly.
And so there's no discussion at all from what you know of from the other services speaking to the DoD about the possibility of something like that?
I'm not aware of that. I'm aware of conversations about increasing cooperation with our close partners, but not specifically expanding the Five Eyes construct. I can take that for the record and get you an answer.
General Brown, thank you again for your testimony, and I appreciate your warning of accelerated change or lose, and your vision for a more flexible and capable force. In your written testimony, you explain the hard decisions the service must make in coordination with Congress on how to modernize the force and develop and field new capabilities, while selectively divesting older platforms. Regarding the A-10, for example, the Air Force itself is planning to divest 21 A-10s from the Indiana Air National Guard in FY23. What is the modernization plan for the remaining A-10s? Will the airframes that have been selected for rewinging be added to that maintenance schedule?
The plan for the long range is we bought the attack kits, and that the attack kit is to rewing the remaining A-10s. If I have the numbers correct, it's about 218 that we'll actually have set to rewing. But the 21 that are going to retire will not be rewinged, and those will get transitioned out, and that guard unit will actually transition to F-16s.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall, in the simplest terms possible, could you describe what agile combat employment is and how it might be implemented in a Taiwan scenario specifically?
Yeah, the idea behind agile combat employment, and I should let Chief Brown talk about this too, because I think he's one of the founding fathers of it, is that we compound the targeting problem for our adversaries by using more than the bases that we normally operate from. There's a hub and spoke concept, if you will, where alternative locations are used to conduct operations. So an adversary would have to target all of those potential locations in order to effectively target our force. And the Air Force has been training people, and it's been doing exercises to demonstrate some of that capability, and the Chief can talk about that a bit more perhaps. What we're doing under the operational imperatives is trying to look at the full mix of investments we would need to make that truly a cost-effective approach. There are limited numbers of bases that we can conceivably use because of the size of runways and the infrastructure that we need. And so they are targetable. We would need to deny targeting capability, but even without it, those fixed sites can still be attacked. So you need to look at a mix of defenses and hardening and other measures that we would want to invest in to make sure that was a robust capability and really preserved our ability to put missions in the air. You know, the tactical air assets that we have deployed forward aren't of much value if they can't get in the air because their runways are taken out, basically, or they can be potentially destroyed themselves on the ground. As well as the infrastructure that supports them. So we have got to protect against that.
So in a Taiwan scenario, to fully realize the vision of agile combat employment, that require new basing agreements, specifically in the Philippines and in Japan?
It would require a combination of factors. One would be host countries or alternate sites that were under our possession, that were prepared to accept the aircraft and use them. We've been practicing agile combat employment in Europe right now as part of the preparations we've made over there. So the concept is sound. It's the right idea. It's the right thing to do. But we have to think through all the things that are required to make it a reality in a wartime situation. Yeah. And we haven't done all that work yet. There's more to be done there.
Putting on my milpers hat, I took the Air Force PFT yesterday. It was fun at bowling. And you had two airmen that were conscripted into doing it with me, so they deserve an attaboy for doing that. So my understanding is if you get a first-class score, you only have to take it once a year. But if you don't meet the height and weight standards, you have to do it twice a year. Is that correct?
Congressman, I want to compliment you on your performance on that test. I heard about it, and it was pretty impressive.
Well, I got old man points. Very generous.
I'll let the Chief talk about the...
But it's not the height and weight, it's a score. And if your score is, if I recall, is below 75, then you do it twice a year versus once a year. So if you get a high score, if you've proven that you're staying pretty fit, then we don't make you do it twice a year.
So there was a story this week. I don't think it's a new policy per se, but if you are an airman undergoing transgender reassignment surgery, you don't have to take it for the year while the surgery is happening. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So then after you transition, let's say you're a biological male and you undergo gender reassignment surgery to become a female, are you then held to the female standards in the test versus the male standards?
The way we do that is based on what the member identifies as for their genders, what drives what tests and other support we provide to those particular members.
Okay, so if you identify as a female, or underwent surgery to become a female, you would then go from having to run to get a max score of 9 minutes and 12 seconds for 1.5 miles to 10 minutes and 23 seconds for 1.5 miles, correct?
Not having the charts in front of me, I know they're different, but that's probably
so that's a difference of 1 minute and 11 seconds, depending on what gender you identify for the run. For push-ups, the change is from 67 push-ups in 1 minute to 47 push-ups in 1 minute. This is for the youngest age. This is 25 and younger. I'm 38, so I got a more generous scale yesterday. I mean, that's a difference of 20 push-ups, right? Going from male to female for the strength portion.
Without the charts in front of me, that's probably close.
And then sit-up goes from 58 to 54. So that's small. That's 4. And then my understanding is you now have the option for every domain. Well, the run you have an option. The strength portion you have an option of sit-up, plank, and then something else that confused me yesterday.
We're in the process of implementing those changes to provide additional options for our members based on how they exercise.
So is the idea to retain the optionality or to coalesce around one for each domain?
Optionality. Well, optionality based on each domain, whether it's aerobic whether it's strength.
I apologize. Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Escobar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panelists for their service and for their leadership and for being with us today. I have the incredible honor and privilege of representing El Paso, Texas, which is home to Fort Bliss, America's second largest military installation and largest joint mobilization force generation installation in the Army. I'd like to take this opportunity, though, to coming on the heels of Mr. Gallagher's comments, or questions rather, I want to thank you all for your recent announcement to expand basic human rights protections to service members and their families. I have to tell you, this is especially important in states like mine, states that have moved to ban gender-affirming care for minors, restrict teaching about sexual orientation in public and gender identity in public schools, and prohibit trans athletes from playing on girls' sports teams. I have spoken with many, many families who feel targeted and who have to shift their worry about other things to worry about care for their kids. And so your leadership and your response to these really targeted discriminatory laws against families in states like mine, I hope it will influence other branches of service to provide similar protections. My question to any one of our panelists who would like to answer this is, as I mentioned, I've heard from constituents, we need our service members focused on their mission, not on their kids' health care or limits to accessing that care. Families should be supported in all ways possible to ensure readiness of our service members. And I understand that through the Exceptional Family Member Program, service members are allowed to be reassigned to different states with safer environments for their families. And so that makes me wonder if you've seen personnel impacted or take advantage of that, and also how the service will account for or think about basing deployment decisions based on this type of quality of life question, especially around discrimination in states like Texas, Florida, and other states. And really for anyone who would like to answer that for me.
Thanks for the question. What we've been doing, what I think you're alluding to, is making sure that our service airmen and guardians are aware of some of the services that they can use because of some of the recent changes in state law. The other services have very similar programs. They have legal assistance, and they have the Exceptional Family Member Program as well. We don't take any position on these laws one or the other, except we recognize the fact that they do affect our people. The Exceptional Family Member Program in particular helps people who have unique medical conditions that may not be treatable in a certain location. Usually it's because of lack of care, because somebody has a condition where either the environment, in case of asthma, would affect them, or because there simply isn't any care in the region where they would be assigned that's appropriate for their specialized condition. Transgender medical condition of gender dysphoria is one that could be affected for some of our people. I'm not aware of any cases where this has happened yet, but I expect it will at some point. This is a condition that often occurs among adolescents, and our dependents will probably be affected by it at some point. So we made them aware that some of the EFMP program in particular was available to them if they were impacted that way.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall. I'm going to move on very quickly to my next question, shifting gears because I've only got about a minute left. General Raymond, as the Space Force has continued to grow, I've been really encouraged by its efforts to reach out to universities for research and prepare the next generation of potential guardians. One of those initiatives is at the University Partnership Program, which included the university in my district, the University of Texas at El Paso. Can you give me a quick update on the initiative and what lies ahead? I've got 30 seconds, so you may have to respond in writing.
I'll be happy to respond in writing, but it's an initiative that we're proud of. It builds partnerships with universities in twofold. One, to help develop and attract talent, and two, to help do some critical research for our critical space needs. We're very pleased to have UTEP as part of that. We've got 11 different universities as part of it, and we're seeing benefits of that already. And I'll be happy to respond in more detail in writing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General Raymond. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Kendall, are you saying that if a service member has a transsexual family member or a family member who might one day want to become a transsexual person, that the Air Force might not send that service member to a state like Florida or a state like Texas based on our laws?
What we do, and we've been doing this for a very long time, is whenever anybody comes up for assignment, they go through a questionnaire about their family and their medical needs and special education, things like that. And based on that questionnaire, we examine whether in the region they might be assigned to, there might be some issue with providing them with what they need. And then if that's the case, we don't assign them there. We find something else, someplace else for them to go. There are about 35,000 servicemen that are under that program right now, and about 55,000 people that are affected by it. So it has a lot of broad applicability.
But usually we would think about this exceptional family member program like if a service member had a child with a specific heart disease and they could only get treatment at Johns Hopkins, you might not send them to a place where they wouldn't be able to access that treatment. What I think is new is that you're now applying that to transsexuals and people who might want to be transsexuals. So again, I want to ask the question very directly. Is it the position of the Air Force that if someone has a transsexual family member and they don't want to go to a state like Florida or Texas, that you will accommodate their request to not go to Florida or Texas based on the gender issues of a family member?
If a service member is under treatment for a recognized medical condition, such as gender dysphoria, and they cannot get that treatment in the state to which they might be assigned, then they could be assigned to another state.
And it's
but
not
there has
just,
to be an actual
and it's not
medical
just if
need.
they're under treatment. Captain Donsworth told the Washington Post, family members receiving gender-affirming treatment or likely to receive such treatment. So isn't it true? Did Captain Donsworth misstate that? Does someone have to?
I'd have to check the exact wording of how the program is set up. But there has to be a identified actual need for medical treatment, not just the potential for one. It has to be more than that. And that's my understanding.
A
I'll
family
get back to you
member
on the
choosing
record
to change their gender would qualify, is what you're saying.
I'm sorry.
So I mean, a family member choosing to change their gender would alter the options you have for where you could put that service member.
I think more would be required. There would have to be a medical need that needs to be met. Just that decision by itself probably wouldn't be enough, but I don't know.
I'm concerned that it's going beyond medical need in some of the statements of some of the folks who work for you. I'm now quoting from Undersecretary Gina Ortiz, who said, "We are closely tracking state laws and legislation to ensure we're prepared to mitigate effects to our airmen, guardsmen, and families." And again, this is dealing with the transsexual issue with the Exceptional Family Member Program. So which state laws and local laws are you particularly concerned about?
We have people in our major installations who track local conditions, including state laws, all the time.
Which ones?
That's what they do, all of them. If there's a change in divorce laws just occurred in one of the states, it could affect our members. So our people have to be aware of that so they can provide counseling to people if they need it.
Well,
I'm
going to move on because I've got another topic to cover, and while that seems deeply frivolous, this is quite serious. I want to go to hypersonics. In what areas is the United States outpacing China in hypersonics?
I think we're outpacing China in air-breathing hypersonics.
Okay.
Cruise missile type application.
Well, those are cruise missiles. Are cruise missiles hypersonic?
A specific type of hypersonic with a scramjet engine that gets above Mach 5.
Well, let me ask this question.
Normal cruise
General
missiles
Van Herk said, China is significantly outpacing us with their capabilities. Was General Van Herk wrong?
No, China has moved to deploy hypersonic weapons more aggressively than the United States has, definitely.
And so when General Van Herk says China's aggressively pursuing hypersonic capability tenfold to what we have done, is that a ratio that is incorrect or correct?
I don't know how he would make that measurement. They have fielded more capability than we have, and they have fairly aggressive development programs in a number of areas. I wouldn't put a number.
More aggressive than ours. So they're developing faster
yes.
than us. I mean, General Brown just said that we're not where we need to be on hypersonic testing, which I think is a helpful admission because we should actually work together to solve that. But what you're saying is they're testing and developing more, they're fielding more, and they're more capable, right? That's the essence of this thing?
They have invested more and they are more capable, but you have to be very careful about these comparisons.
Thank you. That is just like exactly the opposite of what Secretary Lloyd Austin said, and particularly noteworthy. I'm afraid I'm out of time.
Mr. Horsford is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get back to the hearing at hand, which is on the budget. Secretary Kendall, contract adversary error has proven itself to be a cost-effective training enabler for the Air Force Weapons School and during major exercises like Red Flag. In May 2021, the commander of Air Combat Command, General Mark Kelly, wrote, and I quote, "Currently, there is a high opportunity cost to self-generated AD-air, which is the norm for 5th gen squadrons. A pilot flying Red Air is using precious flight hours on the most expensive aircraft and yet not realizing any significant training or readiness value," end quote. So your department told us repeatedly, told me, this committee and industry, that there would be a consistent future need for these services. However, it has been clear for years that the Air Force was looking to improve the capability of these contract aircraft to better reflect the high-end fight. In response to this clear demand signal, this year industry went to 2 allied European air forces and acquired 24 F-16s, the same aircraft flown by the current organic aggressors at Nellis Air Force Base. Last month, I was pleased to learn that the Air Force had also decided to permanently base 9 F-35s at Nellis as part of the 65th Aggressor Squadron at a future unspecified date. In response to a question about this basing decision, the Air Force informed Congress on April 8th that changes to the organic aggressor fleet would not cause a decrease in the number of contracted adversary air pilots, and that there were no projected changes for any contract adversary air company. However, I was surprised to recently learn that at this point, the Air Force had already notified the Nellis adversary air contractor that their contract would not be renewed and that they would have to vacate Nellis by June 4th. The Air Force then told my staff on April 20th, 12 days after informing Congress that no changes to adversary air were planned, that they did not intend to recompete the Nellis contract and that they would transition entirely to organic adversary air beginning on June 4th. Yesterday in our meeting, General Brown, you highlighted the importance of future virtual constructive training at Nellis. And while I fully support efforts to fill these capabilities, I've been told that we are still years away from the infrastructure and the software required to take full advantage of these systems. So I think you can understand my skepticism regarding simulators when problems with the F-35 virtual environment have delayed a full rate production decision for the program by over a decade. And I'm confused how the Air Force plans to replace the 44,000 flying hours, representing 63% of adversary air requirements, that the contractor currently flies at Nellis without the existing organic F-16 fleet, especially when no date has been given for the arrival of F-35s or additional aircraft. So I think it's important to note that the organic aggressors at Nellis have 2 missions: to both fly as aggressors and to support the test and evaluation unit. What happens when test and evaluation requirements compete with training? So I'm deeply concerned that the apparent lack of cohesive adversary air plan will not only continue to lead to uncertainty for my constituents, but also hurt the readiness of our pilots while they wait until an uncertain date for this future virtual environment to be fielded or for F-35s to be delivered. So Secretary Kendall, with no additional aircraft on the ramp and a full capability simulation environment still years away, how does the Air Force intend to bridge the capability gap for adversary air at Nellis? What is the specific strategy for adversary air across Air Combat Command?
Let me start by saying that we do need adversary air. It's an important part of our training regimen. The problem we have right now is that we need 5th generation adversary air. And the current capability we have in our contract doesn't provide that. It's the reason the F-35s are being brought in. That gap exists today, and it can't be healed by extending the contract that's in place. So that's the problem.
Is that the only
You're
need
also
that we have?
working. I'm sorry,
Is
Congressman.
that the only need that we have is to prepare for fifth generation? Don't we have other threats that we also have to continue to prepare for?
It is not the
rest,
only need.
The rest
but
of this
it is a
conversation will have
key
to be
need.
on the
I'll let
record.
General Brown,
I'm sorry, the gentleman's
amplify.
time has expired, Mr. Secretary. I apologize. So the question goes on that long, runs out of time, so you have to submit it for the record. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate all three of you being here today, and thank you for your leadership. A couple statements before I get to a question. First, I would just like to address the President's budget. It calls for a 4.5% increase or 4% increase in spending for the military and a 12% increase for domestic spending, non-military. Pretty good disparity there. We know inflation's at 8.5% though. So effectively, the President's budget is calling for about a 4.5% cut to the military. I don't think that's appropriate in a time of Ukraine and a rising China. So I hope that this committee and Congress increases that spending to at least even with inflation, hopefully more than inflation, to deal with these rising threats. But because of this budget, we're seeing that the Air Force has to grapple with the nuclear recapitalization, whether it's the B-21s, the ICBMs. But because of a 4.5% cut to the spending, you're having to reduce your F-35 buy, and we end up with less aircraft this year than when we started. Same thing with the Navy, less ships by the time we're done. I just think our country's not being served with this kind of reduction in spending. Then tied to that's the Air Force budget. I don't think appropriate that the DoD doesn't account for the pass-through money that the Air Force gets. They're showing a $234 billion budget, roughly a third amongst the services. But yet we know $40 billion that is supposedly the Air Force never enters the hands of the Air Force. It's passed through to other agencies that have nothing to do with the Air Force. 17% of the budget from the OSD that shows it's going to the Air Force never goes to the Air Force. And it makes it hard for Congress, I believe, to deal with this appropriately. We're trying to figure out what is the appropriate budget for the Air Force when you're doing B-21s, new ICBMs, the F-35, and so forth. So I know the Air Force is accounting this right. You're showing a $194 billion budget, and I appreciate your transparency. I think we need that here, too. My first question deals with the electronic warfare part of the budget with the Air Force. I'm grateful the Air Force is showing 4 EC-37s on the unfunded list. I think if we don't fund these this year, we'll have 2 years without a production line, and I worry about losing that expertise. So we're going to try hard to get at least some of those, if not all of them, funded through the unfunded list. But my question would be to the chief, what more can we be doing in Congress for the electronic warfare program? Are we adequately giving you what you need?
Well, I think it's one of these areas we got to continue to work on. And I think you've heard me say publicly before, electronic warfare is an aspect that we have not been as focused on, partly because of the threats we're up against over the course of the past 20 to 30 years. The world has changed. And we've got to put, not only internal to the Air Force, but as we work our budgets, to put more emphasis on electronic warfare and the capability, whether it's done by cyber, how we use AI, machine learning aspects of this, and the platforms that we operate as well. They'll all play a factor in this, not only for us on the offensive, but we also be prepared to operate in that type of environment as well with our platforms and our people.
I think your statements have been very helpful on the electronic warfare program, that we needed to turn around and get pointed the right way. A lot of folks assume the EC-37 is not a near-peer capable aircraft, but it is. Without going into the classified material, it has some of the latest technology, and I'm excited about what it will bring. To our space chief, how does our investment in space capabilities compare with China's? I mean, is it comparable, or they're putting more in, or are we putting more in?
Sir, it's really hard to tell what China's putting in because they're not transparent in their budgets, and there's a blurry line between what's government and what's commercial. So I can tell you. What I can tell you, in this budget, the department has invested pretty significantly in space to make sure that we've got the capabilities.
It's a pretty good increase in space funding. Hopefully it meets the needs. My last question is back to General Brown. We hear reports of airmen, NCOs having to go on SNAP program, needing nutrition help. Should we not look at revising the enlisted pay, especially at the junior ranks? Should we be focusing on this? I guess it's also a question for General Raymond. Should Congress be looking at this more about increasing enlisted pay?
I think across the board, this is something we could continuously take a look at based on the environment. We started out with a conversation on inflation. As we look at our pay and benefits, it's not just the pay, but it's also the benefits that support our family members. And that's an aspect when you think about our airmen. It's not just the pay, but it's the other things that happen in support of them and their families, the communities they live in. And so looking at pay and benefits together, I think would be appropriate.
It seems egregious that we have young enlisted folks on SNAP and other nutrition programs. That's unacceptable. But thank you with that, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Laurie is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I want to start with you, Secretary Kendall. I've been, reading into the details of the Air Force defense budget request, and did you task the service to consider canceling the F-15EX in this budget?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Did you task the Air Force to consider canceling the F-15EX during this budget?
As we went through the budget build process, we looked at a lot of options. And I really don't want to go into the details of what any of those were. We ended up where we ended up after a long process. The numbers we started out initially at were very different than numbers we ended up at for a variety of reasons. So I really can't go into our internal processes very well and what we did in that.
But just to summarize, so instead of canceling the program, which was a recommendation you wanted to look into, you're actually doubling the buy from last year. Can you explain that?
We're accelerating the buy to buy it out. We're actually reducing the total quantity substantially. I think it was 100, and CQ help me with this, 124, we went down to 80 as the total buy. But we're trying to buy that out as quickly as possible. We made some other adjustments in order to do that. It's a more efficient way to buy the capability.
Okay. I would be interested more in, that decision-making process, from our side to understand it. But there's an article that I read. It was published on April 19th in Breaking Defense. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but it has the cost comparison between the F-15EX and the F-35A. The article compares the flyaway cost of the two different aircraft, and it says that the flyaway cost for the F-15EX is 39% higher than the flyaway cost for the F-35A, and that the cost to operate the F-15EX is 10% higher than the F-35. Do you agree with that assessment as outlined in this article?
We haven't had a chance to analyze that. The cost of those two aircraft are roughly comparable. Part of the problem is we're buying a 15EX in relatively...
So you haven't analyzed it? 39% seems like a pretty big delta to me.
We're buying the F-15EX for the unique capabilities that it provides. General Brown mentioned earlier that it's a weapons truck, basically. It carries more munitions than the F-35 can. So for certain missions, like cruise missile defense of the United States or defensive counter-air missions, it's a superior platform, despite the lack of some of the full fifth-generation capabilities. It does have a number of fifth-generation components on it to give it more capability than a baseline F-15 would have.
And for comparison's sake, and if General Brown, you wanted to jump in on this as well, which airframe is more lethal as far as a China-Taiwan scenario is concerned? Which would be more useful for that scenario?
I don't look at just one particular platform. It's the mix of platforms and the aspect of the stealth of the F-35 and its capability. But I'd also take a look at the F-15EX and its ability. It's going to be the first aircraft to carry HACM, a hypersonic air-launched cruise missile that can be carried on a fighter. So it's a combination of the capabilities where you can penetrate, but also do standoff capability. So the two of them complement each other, in addition to the other capabilities that we have on the fighter, in our fighter fleet.
Okay. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Banks is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Brown, in 2018, then Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson announced the Air Force We Need proposal. That proposal stated that the Air Force needs to grow from 312 operational squadrons to 386 operational squadrons by 2030. This also included growing the number of fighter squadrons in the total force from 55 today to 62 fighter squadrons in the future. In light of the latest 2022 National Defense Strategy, does the Air Force still need 62 fighter squadrons in order to compete and deter against the threat that China poses today?
The way I've been thinking about this is the equivalent capability of 62 fighter squadrons. And what I think about is when you look at the operational imperatives and the aspect of the fighter squadrons the way we do today with manned aircraft versus what the secretaries and we're working through on the operational imperatives, the combination of crewed and uncrewed platforms. We're doing it with on NGAD. We're looking at it with B-21, but I think it has applicability across our force. And part of the conversation we're talking about today is what does a future fighter squadron look like? How many manned platforms versus unmanned platforms you will have, and with the number of unmanned platforms, it'll make it much easier for us to expand that fighter capability. And it's not just the capability, but the capacity as well.
Can you talk about how you would posture those fighter squadrons between the Air Force active and reserve components?
You know, one of the areas that we are looking at is we are doing a bit of a global posture review, and one of the things I got to take a look at is to ensure that we have both the right overseas and CONUS mix, so we can have the rotational out of the United States for our airmen and families. At the same time, the right mix between the active and reserve component, and that's ongoing work we're doing right now. And I've got all three components, active, guard, and reserve, in the conversation to ensure that we get the right mix, put a marker out in front of us, and then make sure we're moving in that direction.
Secretary Kendall, could you more specifically describe the Air Force's plan for the A-10 fleet?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I couldn't hear the
I'm
question.
over here, Secretary. Can you more specifically describe for us the plan for the A-10 fleet?
Well, the plan for the FY23 budget is to take 21 A-10s out in Indiana and replace them with F-16. You know, in future years, we are looking at divesting over time the A-10 fleet. That's been something we've been trying to do for some time.
Can you put a timeline on when you would divest of the entire fleet versus the changes that you want to make in this budget?
If we were free to do so, we would divest the entire fleet by the end of the next 5-year plan.
But that's not what not specifically what would happen with this year's budget.
This year, divest 21 in Indiana and replace them with F-16. It's a very specific and I think modest request at this point.
How long have you wanted to make this change?
I think that specific one's been in the works for some time. We were not allowed in the last year to retire the A-10s that we wanted to retire. We were not successful in that endeavor. But they're not what we need for the force for the future, and we'd still like to make that move as soon as we can.
What can you talk about, Secretary Kendall? What aircraft replaces the capabilities of the A-10 if we do divest of them?
The fighter mix that General Brown has talked about, it's not a one-for-one swap out of one aircraft for another. It's about the fighter mix that we're trying to get to over time.
And then for the A-10s that will not be divested of in fiscal year 2023, are you looking at wing modernization programs or any other plans that we should be aware of?
I think we're completing some modest modernization plans that have been in place for a while. So
yeah, very, very modest things that we've already invested in. You know, with the sunset rule, we typically don't try to put a lot of capability, but we got to make sure we balance that risk as we go forward, so we don't have a big gap in capability.
General, can you as well describe or defend the plan, at least just for fiscal year 2023, to make this change and then the divesting of the entire fleet down the road? Explain why it's important.
It's because of the threat. The A-10 is a great airplane in a permissive environment, but I don't expect we'll be in very many permissive environments in the future. And I've got to have a mix of capability that can do a bit of all things. The A-10 cannot do that, in a particular high-threat environment, and that's why we're making that shift.
Can you more specifically talk about the second or third order effect of moving forward with this plan? I mean, what does it allow you to do?
What it allows me to do is there's a manpower piece associated with this, because you have airmen that are actually operating and maintaining A-10s that we'd actually put into F-35s and F-15EXs and eventually NGAD. Those airmen, a 15-year maintainer doesn't come off the bench. You build those, and we got to make that transition. So that's an important aspect of this.
The gentleman's time has expired.